Good afternoon. So welcome you to this webinar on compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Obviously a reminder to mute yourselves, and that we will be taking questions at the end of our time together. So if you want to write them in at any point, our workshop facilitator will be compiling them, and we'll have a Q&A question at the end. So with no further ado, I just wanted to introduce myself and tell you a little bit about today's topic. I'm sure that there's a variety of knowledge base out there. Some of you are probably very familiar with these concepts and kind of want a more up-to-date of what's new, and other people might be quite new to the notions of compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma. So what I'm hopefully going to do is kind of give you a brief overview of what it is, where we're at, and tell you some really exciting stuff that's been going on in the field in the last couple of years. Now, some of you may not know this, but I am part of a secondary traumatic stress think tank that is hosted annually by the National Child Advocacy Center in Huntsville, Alabama. I've worked with child advocacy centers very frequently across the nation. We are currently working with the Zebra Center in Edmonton, and we're actually organizing a full-day vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue workshop in Edmonton in October. So if you're interested in getting some more training on things that are, really pertinent to child advocacy, then I encourage you to look that up, and I'll give you a couple of links later, but Zebra Center is involved in that too, so that's very cool. Okay, so let's just start, give you a little bit of background and who I am and all that kind of stuff. So my name is Françoise Mathieu, and I have a master's in counseling psychology. I'm a registered psychotherapist in the province of Ontario, and I've been in the field for over 22 years. I was a frontline clinician for most of those years, and about 15 years ago became interested in doing more education and research on topics related to stress and compassion fatigue and trauma, and wrote a book on the topic and started developing more and more trainings with some colleagues. And about 3 or 4 years ago, I closed my clinical practice because I was traveling too much, and I just felt like I wanted to focus exclusively on this topic. And so what I do now is I actually deliver these workshops full-time, really across North America, on a very frequent basis, and so does the rest of my team. Just to give you an idea of the folks that we work with, as I said before, we work with child advocacy centers a lot. Anyone involved in child welfare, child protection, child exploitation, trafficking, child pornography, hospitals, social workers, law enforcement, criminal justice system, refugee, immigration board, all of that. Yesterday, I was actually in Kingston delivering to the bilingual justices of the peace, which I think a lot of people think that JPs just do weddings, but they do a lot more than that. And they were talking about some of the significant exposure that they experience in their work. And the week before that, I was in Edmonton at a conference of parents of murdered and missing children. So some pretty heavy topics, and I'm always really honored to be invited to kind of provide a bit of a toolkit for folks who do such challenging work such as yourself. So I always give a bit of context when I start these workshops and tell you a little bit of story. So I want to draw you in a little bit, tell you, since we can't see each other, kind of give you a little bit of a context for how I start these workshops when I do them in person. And that's to tell you a little bit about where I'm from. So you'll see here there's a map of North America. I do a lot of trainings in the States, and I was told half jokingly one day that a lot of Americans can't place themselves on a map, which I'm sure isn't true. So I often actually just show a map of America to show people, where they are and where we're from and all that kind of stuff. And so I live in Kingston, Ontario. I'm originally from Montreal. My family is. I'm clearly French-Canadian, as you can hear. And I've been in Kingston for over 22 years. And Kingston, if you're not from here, is quite an interesting place to do this kind of work because we are the largest prison. We are the prison capital of Canada. Some people have said North America. We have between 7 and 10 correctional facilities and halfway houses and all sorts of stuff like that. And I'll go back to that later, why I'm mentioning that to you. And we have a large military base, and I worked actually with the military for over 10 years working for the Canadian Forces Member Assistance Program. So that's the Employee Assistance Program for soldiers and their families. And I also worked at Queen's University for 7 years as the crisis counselor there. And I did some of these in a way that was overlapping, and I'll talk more about why I'm mentioning that to you a little bit later. But I was actually born in northern Quebec. So you see on the map here, I was born in the high Arctic. I lived in 3 different Inuit villages, actually 1 Cree village, 2 Inuit villages when I was very young. And my parents were teachers up there. My mom was a teacher, in fact, and my father was a school principal and superintendent. And the reason I'm mentioning that to you is that I want to start this presentation by inviting you to reflect on a couple of things for yourself. The first thing I'd like to invite you to reflect on is whether you live and work in the same community. Do you live in the same community that you serve? Is it a fairly small community? Because if it's a small community, what I realized when I was really young, I mean, I just knew no different, is that because we lived in a very small Inuit village, our home was often the restaurant, and it was the food bank, and it was the hotel, and sometimes it was a women's shelter, and that was kind of normal. That's how I grew up. And my parents' message to me and my brother were that, you know, we were very lucky to have received, you know, the education and the support, and that in return, our responsibility was to be of service to the community. It's a very powerful message about, you know, you're here to serve, you're here to do your best, and we all need to pitch in. So I think that's a really great message, and it has its good sides and bad sides, of course. But the first thing I want to invite you to think about is, you know, whatever family you grew up in, whether it was your family of origin or your foster family or your adoptive family, what were the messages that you received about this work? Are you working in a field that people in your family can relate to, or is your family in a completely different field and they don't really understand what you do? And I think there's probably a mixture of both, you know, both groups in our settings, where some of us maybe come from a long line of social workers or folks in law enforcement or nursing or what have you, and other people it's quite the opposite. And when we go back to our loved ones, some people don't always understand what we do, what the impact is, and some people don't necessarily even kind of give value to it. It's just not part of their kind of schema and value system. The other reason I'm mentioning that is that I grew up in a family of parents who were from the war generation. So that's before the boomers. So these are folks who were born, you know, my parents were born in the early 1940s. So they're both 75 years old this year. And I think what's important to remember, and those of you who are around the same age as me will probably agree, is that folks from the war generation did not have very strong knowledge of self-care. Self-care and physical exercise and work-life balance, you know, those were not concepts that existed or that we even ever discussed. And so when I was growing up, there was a very strong message about being of service, but there was no concept of kind of transitioning home and taking care of ourselves in different ways, you know. And I often joke that my mother exercised, you know, once in 1973 and never exercised again. And my father's idea of, you know, unwinding after work was, like many people of his generation, to have a couple of extremely stiff drinks to take a load off, if you will. I'm just hearing that some people are not muted. It's just creating some background noise. You want to make sure that you're muted. Sydney, do you want to check into that? Because it's interfering with I'm not hearing very well. Just make sure you're muted. Yeah.
How do you check?
Some of you are not muted. Signe, can you help us with this?
Oh.
Yes, I'm just going through.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. So basically, that's the second message I want to invite you to reflect on, is what were the messages that you received, and what are your values in terms of self-care and unwinding and transitioning? And I think that what's also difficult is when we work in really challenging environments, maybe communities where there's a lot of struggles, maybe there are a lot of people in need. I certainly know that one of the villages I lived in, you know, which was Kuujjuaq, is currently struggling with an epidemic of teenage suicides, and How do we set limits? How do we figure out where we draw the line when the need will always, always outweigh what you can provide? And that's something I run into a lot when I speak to service providers such as yourselves, where they'll say to me, how can I take a vacation when, how can I leave at 4 o'clock if I know that if I leave, such and such situation won't be addressed? And I want to honor that, and I don't have a perfect answer to that, but I do think that it's an ongoing challenge that we live through. So those are kind of the questions I want to invite you to think about before we move on. What were the messages that you received? And what are the things that are these things valued in your community? And the final thing I want to kind of mention is, what is it like to be living in the same community that you work in on a day-to-day basis? Like when you go out for dinner at night or you go to the grocery store, do you have to avoid certain situations, or are you sometimes, on the clock where you thought you were off, but all of a sudden, someone starts asking you questions about work and all those kinds of things? And those are all realities that we need to navigate, particularly when we live in smaller places. The second thing I want to invite you to think about is, why do you do this work? What floats your boat? And what are the rewards of this work? And I know that some of you may feel some days like the rewards are few and far between, and maybe other times you feel like this is exactly why I do this job. And it's okay. By the way, I don't think we all have to have a Miss America moment every single day, thinking, I am so blessed to do this. Like, no, sometimes we might feel like, well, it pays the bills or it covers the benefits or the mortgage. And I also think that's okay, but we need to navigate. These are all kind of moving parts that we constantly have to think about. So I became interested in the topic of compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma about 15 years ago for a few reasons. First of all, when I did my master's degree in the late 90s, we never discussed these topics, and I now know why. It's that they actually hadn't even been published. The notions hadn't even been kind of invented, if you will. But in my courses, in my master's degree in counseling psychology, we never even really talked about trauma very much, which seems kind of weird now. Well, it seems more than weird. It seems incomprehensible. But it wasn't that long ago that these notions weren't really kind of at the forefront. And I know that a lot of you now hear about, trauma-focused CBT, becoming trauma-informed, and those things just weren't discussed that much. The reason I became interested in this about 15 years ago were for probably 2 or 3 reasons. At the time, I had 2 very young children, and I was working as a crisis counselor at Queen's, and I was also working part-time for the military. And in my wisdom, I was volunteering at one of the local penitentiaries at night, because that's a really great hobby to have when you do trauma work all day. And one of the things I started noticing is that I was very depleted, and I would go home and I would either consume a lot of trauma-related material. So I remember at some point, it was the days where a lot of people were in book clubs, and Oprah's book club list, every single book I later realized was about child abuse and incest. And that's what I would do for fun, and maybe some of you did the same thing, or maybe I watched that terrible television show called Intervention. If you don't know it, it's fine. It's just a pretty voyeuristic, disturbing show about drug addicts. I started realizing that I was having a really hard time unwinding at night, and I also realized that I was having a hard time connecting with my loved ones who were not in this field. So I might have a friend who had what, she might call a crisis, and I would think to myself, oh my goodness, you have no idea, So I started finding that this work was impacting me on a personal level. But more importantly, what I started realizing is that I was becoming increasingly angry at the system. I was very lucky. I did not develop compassion fatigue very much towards my clients. When I talk about compassion fatigue in this context, I'm referring to that gradual erosion of your empathy, that fatigue where you just think, oh my gosh, I've seen so many identical cases. And I often give the example, and I'm sure some of you have had this, if you've ever had a friend go through the world's longest ever breakup or fertility crisis, isn't it true that after a while, even though their suffering is real and legitimate, isn't it true that after a while you shift to a point where you're like, I just got nothing. I have nothing for this story. I have nothing left to give you. And all of us experience that sometimes at work as well, either with the same cases, so maybe you're working with complex cases of folks who you work really, really hard to kind of fix and help and set up things, and they sabotage, they no-show, they undo all the hard work you had done. Well, how many times are you going to be able to, experience that and not feel a shift in your ability to feel compassion? Sorry, I'm just drinking some water. And the other piece that I started noticing is that I was angry because of the systemic failures. So I would have some wonderful clients who deserved help and they deserved counseling and resources, or maybe they had no money and they were going to have to quit out of school or what have you. And I just became really frustrated because my system, like many of yours, was broken. And it was broken at many levels. It was broken at the, community level. I had nowhere to send people. It was broken at other levels. And I found that actually for me was more a source of depletion more than the rest. Of course the trauma stories were hard and they hitched a ride with me. And of course the repeated chronicity hitched a ride with me and eroded my ability sometimes. But what I really noticed in hindsight, and I'll be honest with you, I didn't really know all this 15 years ago. I just knew I was feeling all sorts of stuff. And my loved ones were commenting on that. And it wasn't until later that I looked back and I thought, oh, that was called moral distress, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. So we started doing a lot of this work, and I wrote a book on the topic that some of you may know, and it's called the Compassion Fatigue Workbook. And I designed this book originally for Northern Victim of Crime Services. So the Northwest Territories had a whole bunch of folks who were working in very isolated areas doing witness support and court accompaniment, and they didn't have the funds to have a full-day training come to them. So I wrote this book. And if you're interested, it's really, really full of checklists and self-assessments, and there's tons there that people find helpful. It's been around since 2012. To write this book, I interviewed a whole bunch of folks from every profession in the helping field. And one of them, and this is actually how the book begins, was a community health nurse who worked in a very busy clinic in Toronto. And at some point in November, around November 5th, she took her daughter to work. It was her grade 9 daughter. And as some of you know, there's a thing called Take Your Children to Work Day, and you take your kids to work, and they shadow you for the day. And she takes her daughter to work, and she spends the day with her. And at the end of the day, they sit down at dinner, and she says to her daughter, so honey, like, what did you think? And her daughter says, Mom, I found out something really, really interesting today. I found out that you're a heck of a lot nicer at home than at work. Or at work than at home, sorry. I find that you're a lot nicer at work than you are at home. And that really landed for her, and I'll be honest with you, it landed for me as well. And I started thinking about that, isn't it true that many of us, we give and we give all day, and then what happens? And, what are the collateral kind of consequences of that? So our team at TEND, there's 8 of us. My co-executive director, Dr. Pat Fisher, and I do this full time. And we travel all over North America. And 6 members of our team do this part-time as well. And the reason I'm mentioning that to you, and I'm showing you kind of a slide of a variety of really, really varied groups that we work with, is that it doesn't really matter where we are. We're hearing the same stories over and over again. We work in Florida. We had a 3-year contract with the Department of Children and Families in Florida. As many of you know, Florida has one of the highest rate of child abuse-related deaths in the country. They believe it is directly related to the opiate epidemic and the pill mills that were established in the late 90s in the kind of the upper panhandle of Florida, so very impoverished communities. And a few years ago there was, I won't slime you with the detail, but there was a terrible tragic fatality of somebody in a family, a grandfather eliminated his entire family, and there were many, many people in that family, and they were all children, and it was, they were known to the system, but things fell through the cracks due to the lack of resources. And so those are the kinds of situations where we're called in sometimes to try and look at systems and try and support staff better. Because as you know, if you work in child protection, we are often overloaded, we have too many cases, and then God forbid something goes wrong, and then we are, our head is on a stake because somewhere someone has to be blamed. And those become really difficult and sometimes unsustainable systems and situations. But what I found really interesting is whether we're working in California, in Colorado, in Florida, Hawaii, in Ontario, or in the Northwest Territory, we're kind of hearing the same story over and over again. And I want to invite you to think about whether this is true for you. one of the things that we're hearing is a lot of these folks in these various services are actually working with the same complex families, either at exactly the same time or at different times in their lives, meaning that maybe you're in youth justice, and if that doesn't go well, you will probably end up having one of those folks in the federal system, adult correctional system later. Or maybe, like in Kingston, for example, because of our correctional history, we have a very impoverished part of town. In fact, I read somewhere recently that Kingston has one of the highest income discrepancies in the country. We don't have a lot of super rich people, but we have a lot of really impoverished individuals. And so the gap is quite large. And these are families who moved here historically to be close to their loved ones who were incarcerated and never left. And some of these families have been on social assistance or disability for 3 generations. These are complex families, and as you can imagine, there are many elements of our system that are involved in assisting them with varying degrees of success. So I started hearing that. I also started hearing that I wasn't really hearing that much difference. I mean, of course, we're very different from the United States, thank goodness, right now. But I was hearing very similar challenges overall. You know, when I'm down in Huntsville at the National Child Advocacy Center, they are describing very similar challenges than we are in terms of volume, lack of resources, and also challenges with multidisciplinary teams, which often work really well, but in some places they work better than others. I'll just give you one quick final example of that. As you know, unfortunately, there have been quite a few police-involved shootings in the last little while in the States. And there was a place in North Carolina where there was a police-involved shooting, a fatality of a young black male. And it created some tension with the multidisciplinary team because there were really mixed feelings about what had happened, and the folks from law enforcement who were on the team had a certain perspective, and so on and so forth. So I think that we sometimes also need to look at the very big picture of, you know, what systems are we working in, what are the political and geopolitical, you know, issues that are going on. And I could go on and talk more about that, but I want to kind of go back and focus on you. So I just want to give you an overview of some of those issues. So this is an extremely brief history lesson on compassion fatigue and where it all came from. It's basically about 25 to 27 years old as a field, but as you know, it takes many decades for things to become commonly known. A quick example of that is the term post-traumatic stress disorder was not actually put in the psychiatric manual until 1980, 1983. It was clear that people were experiencing trauma and stress effects from trauma. You know, many, many years of data was collected, but it really wasn't until 80, 83 that it became a diagnostic. And it really, in Canada, didn't really become a recognized really situation or reality until really the very late 1990s or early aughts, where people like General Dallaire, who had been in Rwanda, started openly talking about his PTSD. So it takes time for things to trickle down. So the same is true with compassion fatigue and secondary trauma. And what started happening is that in the late 80s and early 90s, there were some clinicians that were starting to notice that their service providers were experiencing effects of being exposed to stories. So some of the folks that did some of the original work, for example, Lorianne Perlman, who's there at the top right, is a gracious, wonderful scholar, and Karen Whitney, who wrote a book called Transforming the Pain and Trauma in the Therapist, and this research paper and other subsequent work, they started noticing that being a therapist who did treatment of victims of sexual violence obviously had an impact on the clinicians. The same was found with lots of different professions. Interestingly enough, some of the first groups that were studied in the late 80s, early 90s were folks, well, some of these won't surprise you. So we had folks in child protection and child welfare. I think that makes sense to everybody. We had pediatric oncology nurses. There was a study done in Florida of nurses who worked in cancer care, and they had very high rates of what we called burnout at the time. And I think it's largely, of course, related to working with children who are suffering, and there was also a very high mortality rate. Luckily, it's still not eradicated, but luckily it's better now. But in those days, you know, up to 95% of children with cancer would die, so it was very, very difficult. And they also started doing some research with social workers. So for example, after 9/11, there was a study done of social workers who had debriefed survivors of the Twin Towers, and they were found to have what looked like secondary or what looked like post-traumatic stress disorder elements, if not the full-blown diagnosis, but there was no label for that. And so that's what Charles Figley, Dr. Charles Figley from Florida at the time, a psychologist, trauma expert, started doing is he started doing research to try and understand what is this thing that looks like PTSD but can't be PTSD, because back in those days the criteria was that in order to have PTSD, it had to have happened to you. You had to be there. That was actually, in fact, what Vietnam veterans used to say. That was their line. They said you had to be there to understand how terrible it was. And what Dr. Figley and Sequitney and Perlman and others started realizing is that you did not need to have been there to be impacted, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. Another group that was studied quite early on were actually animal protection workers and animal welfare workers, which sometimes surprise folks until we think about the fact that, I mean, who works in animal protection and animal welfare? People who love animals, right? And what do they do? Well, it's very rare that they're caring for well-loved animals. They're in fact dealing with animals who've experienced neglect and sometimes, unfortunately, some violence, who've been involved, you know, when there's domestic violence and there's a pet, there's often an involvement there. And they're also seeing the moral distress of folks who maybe can't afford the treatment for a certain pet. It's interesting, it turns out that veterinarians have actually quite a high suicide rate, and there are some hypotheses as to why that may be, and you know, it's kind of pointing to that direction as well. So that was the original research that was done, and then over the years it expanded to a whole bunch of folks, including now, you know, there's studies looking at allied health professionals and sign language interpreters and courtroom, you know, clerks. You may recall that a few months ago there's a juror who sat on the Tory Stafford murder trial in, I believe that happened in Woodstock or Stratford, I apologize, in one of those places, and the juror has actually sued the province for experiencing trauma as a result of exposure to this. So it's becoming recognized, but really for the first few years, so, you know, Charles Figley and others were able to prove this was a thing and it existed. But people like me who started, you know, reading and thinking about these concepts in the late 90s, our first question, which maybe the question is on your mind today, was, okay, that's great, well, what do we do about it? And really they didn't know, because they were just experimenting with things. And so it wasn't until about 1997 that Eric Gentry and Anna Baranowski and Dunning, I believe, did an experiment to see, you know, is there a treatment modality that can help folks who are experiencing all of these effects, and they developed the ARP, the Accelerated Recovery Protocol. But really after that, there wasn't much research done on this. Really what was recommended at the time was, and I understand why it was kind of the first line of suggestion, was self-care. And all of you have heard about that. We all kind of hypothesized that if you could take very good care of yourself and have good work-life balance and be healthy and well-rested, maybe that was a first line. And I still agree with that. In fact, right hot off the press, I don't know if any of you saw in the news this morning that the Ottawa Police has, it's fantastic, has implemented, you know, access to, I have to read it again because I read the paper really quickly this morning, but someone was telling me access for their staff and loved ones to unlimited psychological support. If that is true, that's just incredible. And they also are focusing on wellness, wanting to make sure that their officers are well rested. And so they're going to actually look at rejigging the shift. I think it's their union that negotiated the rejigging the shift work and the way it's being done, so that police officers have a chance to have proper restorative sleep in order to do their job better. If that's true, that's just amazing and so exciting. So I'm not suggesting that self-care doesn't matter, but I think what started happening, and those of you who've been around for a while, I bet you had this reaction at some point, it kind of became like the fix-all. You know, a lot of workplaces embrace this with great enthusiasm, and they'd be like giving everyone stress balls and, you know, encouraging, you know, wellness, this and that, and luncheons and apples and carrots and, you know, stuff like that. And the problem with that is that it didn't actually make that big a difference to the bulk of the population of folks like us who are working in high-stress, trauma-exposed environments. In fact, there was a study done, and I'm getting ahead of myself here, but there was a study done in 2005 that discovered that for that particular cohort that they studied, it actually had made no difference. I'm not saying self-care doesn't matter, by the way. I'm going to go back to that. But I guess I started thinking, and folks in my think tank started thinking, maybe it's more complicated than that, and we need to unpack this and kind of figure out, you know, what works and what's going on. So I want to kind of present to you the constellation of how we're seeing it right now. Now, I need to let you know that our think tank meets regularly twice a year in person and then on the phone, and this is a evolving process. You know, I started out with 3 Venn diagrams. I was like, okay, so there's this thing called compassion fatigue, but it's not quite the same as secondary trauma. And then there's this thing called burnout. But when I talk to the thousands of people I talk to, they're saying it's not quite the same. You know, so we've been kind of teasing this apart over time. So I kind of want to walk you through this because this can actually become your best tool. And so if you don't mind taking a minute here, if you're sitting by yourself, if you're in public, don't do this, but if you're sitting by yourself and have access to a pen and paper, I'd like to encourage you to fill this out as I talk about it to try and see where you'd fit yourself in right now. So one of the things that we recognize and that we learned is that we've all got stuff. You know, I'm a therapist, and so in my practice, I have seen people from every walk of life, from, you know, the lieutenant colonel to the general to the taxi driver to the Loblaws. I had a contract with Loblaws at some point, all the banks, the priests, everybody needed support at some point, and that's not weird at all. I never saw a general. I was just kidding. But I definitely saw lots of senior officers. And so I started realizing that, you know, a lot of us also are attracted to this field for personal reasons, that maybe we had a history of something. I want to give you 2 really quick examples of that. If you go to any program on nutrition or I can't say that word in English, but to become a dietitian, you will find that a very large percentage of people who are in that program, you know, to do a degree and become a nutritionist or dietitian, a very large percentage of the folks in that program used to or still have an eating disorder, or someone in their family had one. I don't think that's weird. I think it's pretty normal that you'd become interested in something that, you know, was something you struggled with or were interested in. The same is true with the child and youth worker programs. We have an excellent program here at St. Lawrence College, and maybe some of you are CYW's really outstanding 3-year degree. And it's not surprising that several of the student population in the child and youth worker program had their own history of being in foster care. I meet some every year, and they said, you know, I was a Crown ward, or I was in 15 foster homes, or what have you. I met one just the other day, and she said, you know, I really appreciated the help that was given to me, and I really want to go into that field. So I don't think that's weird, and I don't think it necessarily means that you're not cut out to do this work, but I do think it highlights some vulnerabilities that you need to look for. I also want to suggest that a lot of us who don't even necessarily have that type of history also have our own issues, and we just need to make sure that those issues are resolved or that we have access to proper support. You know, for example, in drug and addiction counseling, substance abuse counselors are very open about the fact that many of them are in recovery, and they talk about working on their stuff, especially when, you know, maybe they're challenged or taxed or triggered by something that happens. So I feel like in some of our fields, and I'm particularly targeting medicine and mental health here, I find that a lot of the folks I talk to still carry a huge stigma around mental illness and mental health. And, you know, a lot of my friends who are therapists go see another therapist for support, which is great, but they do it all in secret because there's still this big stigma around it. So I think that that's something we need to work through. So the first piece here is, what are your personal vulnerabilities? You know, what's your stuff? And what are the things that may push your buttons? I know, for example, I work with a lot of parents of missing and murdered children, and who are obviously advocates, and that's great, but they really, really need to make sure they take good care of themselves because they have their own trauma history. The second piece is called traumatic grief and loss in the workplace. And in this instance, we're referring to situations where maybe unfortunately you've lost someone. Maybe there's been God forbid, there's been a tragedy and a child has died. Or maybe a child moved and you never saw them again and you never had closure. Or maybe someone in your workplace died. Maybe you lost a loved one. Could you make sure you mute yourself because I can hear some noise?
It's okay.
Yeah, I can hear you. It could also be that you lost a beloved colleague, or maybe there was a staffing change, or one of your colleagues was transferred, or you lost a beloved supervisor. Those are all losses, and of course they're all to varying degrees. But the question is, do you have a venue and time to even process those things? Or, I was recently in the Children's Hospital in Memphis, and it was an oncology hospital, and they said, no, because when the kid goes, whether he's, survived or got healthy or not, we have to fill that bed right away. And sometimes they said, they felt like they hadn't had a ritual to put that to rest. So as I'm going through these, I'm really inviting you to think about, does this land true for you? And for some of you so far, you're like, no, neither of those circles land, so let's keep going and see if the next ones do. Direct exposure is also called primary trauma. And primary trauma, everyone understands what it is when they hear it. It's stuff that happened to you or that you were a direct witness to. So if you are someone who did child protection investigations and you walk into a home where there's some abuse going on and you're a witness to that, that is, of course, primary trauma. I would argue that Roméo Dallaire, when he was in Rwanda, although he was not necessarily ever attacked or threatened, that he was direct witness to what happened. That's direct or primary trauma. A lot of first responders are exposed to that. It's stuff that happened to you, around you, or to people very, very close to you. Now, luckily for some of us, we will very rarely be exposed to direct exposure, but we will have a lot of secondary indirect exposure. And this is something I feel so strongly about that I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about this. Secondary or vicarious trauma, as it's known, refers to all the different ways in which you're exposed to traumatic content in your job, in your personal life, and through all sorts of other mediums. So let's take our personal life for a second. That could be what you watch on the news, which is extremely graphic now. There's no filter anymore, and they kind of show, images. You can find them anywhere on the web. Could be material that you consume in terms of movies you watch. There's some movies on Netflix, for example, or some TV shows that are extremely graphic. And is that a good idea? When you do this job all day. I have a friend who's a parole officer, and she went to my workshop recently. And after, she said, I realized she's single, so she gets home and there's her dog. And she said, I realized that I go home after my job as a parole officer and I watch CSI or Law and Order all night. Is that such a good idea? The other way in which we're exposed to a lot of indirect trauma is, of course, through the casework that we do. So clients who disclose information and we have to collect that data or listen to them or bear witness. We also are exposed to a lot of secondary or indirect trauma through court. If you go to court a lot and you're exposed to visuals, photos, images, and stories. We also are exposed to a lot of secondary trauma through each other. So I know that a lot of you, and by the way, this is not a blame, but it's a fact, a lot of us, we kind of like to tell quote-unquote war stories. We'll be like in the lunchroom and we'll be debriefing a case, and sometimes it becomes like a competition where it's like, oh, that's nothing, wait till you hear what I saw, And the other place where I find that we're exposed to a tremendous amount of unnecessary indirect trauma is at trauma conferences. So I go to the annual Child Abuse Symposium in Huntsville, Alabama, that's organized by the National Child Advocacy Center. And this year, I won't slime you with the details, but we had a couple of instances. If you don't know, it's a very large conference, about 2,000 participants. So lots of different workshops on forensic stuff, a lot of child abuse investigation stuff. And one of the presenters began his entire workshop without an introduction or a name or a context or a warning. He just popped in a DVD and it showed a 13-minute video of a mother abusing her child. People were gasping, people were shocked. He thought it was completely normal to do that. Now, I understand if you're a forensic examiner and you need to show me a picture of a bruise so I know how to, label it the next time I see a bruise, That I understand. But even within those contexts, there's ways and there's some care that we can apply to make sure that we're not necessarily willy-nilly just exposing people to lots of material that is absolutely not necessary. When I was there, I had the privilege of meeting someone who works for Dropbox, and she used to work for YouTube, and she is the content moderator supervisor. So what she does is she oversees the team that, as you know, there's content moderation that has to be done in all of these platforms, and unfortunately they're often exposed to, well, part of their job is to flag things, take them down when they involve breaking the law in various ways, and unfortunately, of course, some of that is viewing very disturbing material. So one of the things that Dropbox decided to do is to support their staff by doing that in moderation. So these folks only work 4 hours a day instead of 8. They're actually paid for 8 hours a day, but they're paid for 4 hours a day. They don't have to do them back to back. And she was telling us that they've designed some, you know, because they're computer geeks and super smart, they've designed some technology that some of you may be familiar with, which is basically some form of scrambling technology, so that they can look at the images in a modified way. So sometimes they can look at the images upside down or scramble something except one part, because all they really need to know is this person underage or is this activity illegal, so that they are not constantly exposed to thousands and thousands and thousands of stories. This is a big deal, and it's a big deal for people who work in anything related to child welfare, so that's why I'm spending some time on that. And it also becomes your strategy to start thinking about, are there ways for me to modulate exposure, and is there a way for us as a team that we could kind of take it easy on the sliming, which we call sliming is when you debrief yourself all over other people without their consent, and that happens a lot. So if you remember, you know, nothing else from this webinar, to really go out there, and I really invite you to take a bit of a trauma input like survey, take an inventory of your day-to-day life. You know, how much trauma is coming at you at home, in your leisure activities, through debriefing, through case conferencing, and is there some of that that we can moderate? Obviously, we don't want to silence our clients. We want them to feel fully able to talk about whatever they want. But if you're well enough, that's not a problem. But if you're full of these stories, at some point, it can become a problem. Now, some of you, you're listening to this and you're thinking, this doesn't bother me at all. I've been around the block. I've heard a million stories. They don't bother me. But numbness is also problematic. So a judge said to me recently, she said, what is the right amount? Like, what's the difference? And I said, well, it's an amazing question. She said, you know, how do I know that I'm carrying just the right amount? And it's actually a concept that was developed by Richard Harrison at the UBC, and he called it exquisite empathy. And exquisite empathy is exactly that. Exquisite empathy is carrying just the right amount so that you're fully present, you're really listening, you're not profiling, you're not making assumptions, you're not filling out the paperwork before people stop, you know, that kind of thing. But you're also not sitting there sobbing and devastated and, you know, totally triggered. And that's what we're constantly trying to find. Compassion fatigue, I mentioned before, is the erosion of empathy, that emotional, physical, gradual exhaustion where at some point you just think, I've just got nothing. And that can, of course, happen at home or at work. And, of course, it can co-occur with a lot of indirect trauma, and they often go hand in hand, but they don't necessarily always do. I'll give you a concrete example of that. If your mother suffers from dementia, and you are a caregiver for her at home, you may absolutely be totally exhausted, and you may develop an erosion of your energy and your patience for her, and that's related to compassion fatigue. You may or may not have trauma. It might be very traumatic that your mom has dementia, or it might not be. It might be the way it's been for a really long time. So some professionals are at risk of developing both, of course, depending on how much exposure they have, and other folks are at risk of developing more compassion fatigue than indirect trauma, depending on the kind of work they do. This is where the moral distress piece comes in. So I call it systems failure here. These are situations where you are incredibly angry, frustrated, enraged even about ways in which the system is breaking down. There are millions of examples I could give you. I'm sure you could come up with your own. I'll give you a couple of really quick ones. I know that people who work in child protection and child welfare often say that they are troubled by the aging out process, that happens at various times depending on jurisdiction, where someone all of a sudden turned a certain age and all of a sudden off they go. Good luck, little buddy, even though, a week ago you had all these supports and now you've got nothing. And I know that some people feel very frustrated around that. Systems failures are often related to laws, rules, regulations, procedures, lack of resources. We don't have enough money, we need this bed, so we do early discharge to nothing. I was talking recently to a prison psychologist who works in Colorado, and she said, oh no, it wasn't Colorado, somewhere else in the state. And she said that she was extremely frustrated because her agency, her prison, had discontinued methadone treatment for drug-addicted pregnant mothers. So that was a really good example of that as well. I'll go back to systems failures in a minute. The final one is burnout, and burnout is related to your working conditions. Burnout is related to your hours, your rewards, your recognition, your pay, who you immediately report to. Do you have a supportive manager? Are you working in a healthy place or not? And that can happen in any occupation. It's not necessarily related to the helping field at all. I'm sure some of you had part-time jobs at some point in your life that were pretty crummy. Someone said to me yesterday she worked in a chicken plant. Well, you could, of course, have burnout working there. It's got to do with your hours, your pay, your conditions, and all of that. But as you can see, if you look at the full picture, many of us have certain amounts of each of these things. So if we were doing a day-long workshop together, what I would encourage you to do right now is to fill this out. And personally, without sharing with other people necessarily, but just take a look and say, like, where are you at with all of this? Which one stands out? And the solutions will become individualized depending on which one stands out for you. If you have a lot of personal stuff, well, that's, you need to go and get some support around those issues and do your work. If you have a lot of trauma-related exposure, whether it's direct or indirect, support, obviously trauma counseling can be helpful, but so can grounding skills, finding ways, neurofeedback, EMDR, emotional freedom technique, mindfulness. Those things have been found to be extremely helpful to help deal with the exposure you had in the past, but also giving you the tools to deal with the exposure that's coming down the pipe inevitably. We also find that proper timely debriefing is really helpful, providing that it's done in the correct way. There was one more piece I wanted to add in terms. Oh yeah, and the final one is, I know this sounds a little trite, but reducing exposure. Which, my friend Robin always said that's from the Journal of Duh, but it's true. So I know that there are times when I'm dealing with very difficult cases. When I was down in Florida dealing with that multi-casualty situation, I wasn't going to go home and watch The Wire or Breaking Bad on TV. That's just a bad idea. I needed to really keep my energy up, and I needed to sleep more and eat well and not drink alcohol. And, I needed to take good care of myself so I can deal with those types of things as well. I want to go back to moral distress because I'm finding more and more as I'm traveling across the country that I'm hearing folks say, I'm not struggling so much with the compassion fatigue. Like, I care about my clients and I do a good job. I'm angry all the time at the system. And so that is actually what is referred to as moral distress. Moral distress comes originally from the field of medical ethics. And as you know, every hospital has a medical ethicist on call, and they contact him when they have big decisions to make, who should get this organ transplant? Should we let these parents who have certain religious beliefs and they don't want their kid to get a blood transfusion, should we allow that? I'm sure you're familiar with those kinds of things. And moral distress happens when there are basically inconsistencies between your beliefs and what you are being mandated to do by rules, regulations, laws, policies, and all of that. So I can give you a couple of really quick examples. There was a few years ago, I was a hospice volunteer for 3 years. I was a palliative care volunteer, and I was matched with a patient who was elderly and did not speak English. Now, Kingston is primarily Anglophone, and it would be quite unusual to get, full medical care in French there. And so she spoke French and Arabic, but not English. And when I first met her, she had end-stage kidney failure and some cancer and stuff like that. She was older, and she was definitely at the end of her life. I realized that her family had lied to her about some of her medical conditions. And I was really troubled by that. And they did it for a very noble cause. They were lovely people who were misguided. But I realized at some point that I felt a tremendous amount of moral distress because I wasn't quite sure what my role was. And I remember at some point she said to me, you know, I'm so exhausted, this dialysis is so difficult, and she was really starting to fail. And she said, you know, am I allowed to discontinue dialysis? Which, of course, the answer is absolutely, that's your choice. But she had no one to discuss this with because I didn't speak French or Arabic, and her family wouldn't allow that conversation because they didn't want her to go. So, you know, those are situations where it's not necessarily that there's anyone that's ill-meaning, but they're problematic, and I found that very difficult. There was a really interesting case in the fall that came in the news that some of you must have seen. And it was a case of a couple of patients had this life-threatening tropical illness that's very, very rare in Canada, and the treatment for it is prohibitively expensive. I'm going to make this up, but I seem to recall it was something like $2,500 a pill or something crazy. And as you probably know, when you have these exceptionalities and people don't have the ability to pay, you need to apply to a special fund, you know, at the province level and see whether they authorize it or not. In this instance, the funding was denied, so the patient died. The physician who either was involved or had been, you know, privy to the story was a tropical disease specialist, and he happened to be, I believe it was in Mozambique, the following week. And he was at a conference there, and he went into a pharmacy, popped $60 down on the table, and bought the meds that were needed, came home, gave the second patient 2 doses, and saved his life. And he was quoted in the Globe and Mail as saying, you know, what I did was probably illegal, but it sure as hell wasn't unethical. And those are situations where sometimes we take the law into our own hands and, you know, the devil may care, but some other times we don't have that option, plus it's not a good idea to, you know, just become vigilantes and just start rescuing the world, because that's also not sustainable. But I really believe that moral distress is something we're going to be discussing more and more, because I think that it's actually a really big source of burnout in our folks. And part of the challenge with moral distress is, what do you do about it? Who do you talk to? When you're upset about something, and I have so many examples, I won't bore you with all of them, but when I worked at the university, I had so many examples, and it's actually why I left at some point. It wasn't the clients, it was the bullshit. Like, I could not, and I'm not blaming anyone, by the way, it was a resource issue, it was a money issue, it wasn't any particular person that was responsible for that. But we didn't have enough sessions, you know, it was a mess. And, you know, a year later, we had 6 deaths on campus, and a whole bunch of funding became available. And I was partly happy, and partly, I'll just be really honest, I was a little bit cynical, and I thought, right, that's what we needed to have happen. But isn't that true that in many of your workplaces that, you know, as a community and a population and a country, we're very reactive? You know, so some tragic event happens, poof, there's a whole bunch of money to address it. I'm not judging that, but I think that when we're in the trenches, that can be difficult. If you're looking for more tools on anything I'm discussing today, and particularly the moral distress piece, I want to invite you to read my friend Laura Van de Noot-Lipsky's book. Laura's also got a wonderful TED Talk. You can just look it up, just Google her name. And Trauma Stewardship is just a masterpiece. She and I actually coincidentally wrote the books at the same time. We didn't know each other, and then we met subsequently and thought, oh my gosh, we are 2 peas in a pod. And her book really talks very eloquently about that. She also works with, she interviewed folks who work in refugee camps. She interviewed field biologists who work with endangered species, and she has just a wonderful perspective on this, and I really recommend this book. Okay, I'm just going to take a quick sip of water in case you hear silence. Okay, so now let's talk about the next piece. The next piece we need to think about is, what are the ripple effects of, well, a couple of things. What is a ripple effect if something has gone terribly wrong? Let's say there's been a tragic event related to your agency, maybe sadly some tragic event has happened to a client. How does everyone deal with that? How are you affected by it? And, you know, there's obviously the folks at the epicenter, which are the loved ones and maybe the caseworker that was directly assigned. But there are a lot of residual effects, and sometimes we're not aware of those until years later. An example of that is the Russell Williams case that happened some years ago in Trenton, and you'll recall that the Commander-in-Chief of the Air Force Base of Trenton turned out to be a serial killer and a rapist and did terrible things. And, you know, we witnessed still the ripple effects of that in many, many different ways in our community in a way that we didn't necessarily even think about at the time. You know, so many things, you know, everyone who knew the victims, everyone who worked with them, the children of the people who worked with them, the people who were in court, the crime scene photographers, the judges, the juries, the police officers, like it just went on and on and on. And I think that that's part of what we need to recognize when there is either a mass casualty event or there's a tragic event in our communities. And, you know, in Ontario, we've had several things happen recently that where you could kind of study that. You know, how does our community heal? What is the impact? And how do those things accumulate as well? The other piece I want to invite you to think about are your support staff. And I joke often that, you know, our frontline admin are kind of like the bartender in the workplace where at the end of the day we lean over the desk and we're like, oh, I had a heck of a day, and then we slime them with all the details of what happened. And the question is, you know, are they ever offered this training? Is your admin staff listening to this right now? The truth is that our clients, the people we serve, do not have a clue what we do for a living. And if I walked into your child advocacy office, I would not know who's the what of the this, of the that, right? Well, I know the cops, obviously, because they walk differently. But you know what I mean. Like the rest of them, we don't necessarily know. And so your frontline, your clients or whoever you work with are sometimes going to yell and disclose and slime and do all sorts of stuff to your frontline staff because, you know, they're the people who answered the door. And so they also obviously deserve and need this support as well. So let's go back to what I started with earlier. Is self-care enough? Obviously, before I say this, and if some of you have to sign off before the end, the answer is no. But it's crucial. So that's the message. Self-care is not enough, but self-care is, of course, absolutely important. And I'm going to talk about that right now. University of Toronto researchers Ted Bobber and Cheryl Rieger did a study in 05-06 where they asked that very question. This was replicated later by a couple of people. And they did a cross-sectional study of 259 therapists. And they basically said, you know, who did trauma work? And the question was, did self-care help or not? And what they discovered, which was quite alarming to me when I read the paper, was a couple of things. The first thing they discovered is that believing in self-care did not actually mean that people did it any more often than anyone else. You know, maybe you own a juicer and a pair of running shoes, but do you use them? Owning them does not actually, you know, make any difference. It's like putting a book under your pillow 3 days before your exam when you haven't gone to class. So we found that that was one factor. And the other thing that they found, which was more alarming even, was that self-care did not actually reduce the trauma scores of the people that they had studied. And that's where I was like, hang on a second, this is a problem. So I'll talk more about that in a minute. Bobber and Rieger also said that they were concerned that work-life balance had become for some agencies kind of the catch-all solution to everything, you know, that basically they were like, well, if you had better self-care, you wouldn't be burnt out, or have that on my desk by 4, but make sure you know, walk and do your lunch. And, you know, that there was kind of some agencies had some double speak about this. And I remember at some point a really great director of a children's law center said to me, you know, why are staff not going to the mindfulness luncheons? And I said to her, you know, respectfully, this was a children's court. I said, are the courtrooms open? Like, are they running at lunch? And she said, yes, why? And I said, well, how are they going to go to your mindfulness lunch? They're in court. And she's like, oh, shit. You know, and she meant well, but I think that what's also happened is some of us, myself included, I don't really want to be told how to look after myself by my employer. I want to have the time to do it. So this was actually what was found by my good friend Carl Killian, who was at the York University at the time, and he did a great study in 08 that I really recommend. And if you have trouble finding it, just email me. I'll send it to you. It's just great. And what he did is he did a study, and what he discovered is what really made a difference were the following. Organizational changes made a difference, right? Having better working conditions, more control over your schedule, being able to start when you want, stop when you need, take your little poopsie to the recital in the middle of the day, take your mom for MRI. It wasn't that people didn't want to work, they just wanted to work differently. And of course, reduced exposure to trauma made a huge difference, as did having proper, timely supervision as well. But listen, I'm not throwing the baby out with the bathwater here, and I don't want the take-home message from this webinar to be, oh, self-care, screw that, you know, let's go outside and smoke. Like, that's not what I'm saying at all. In fact, if you're interested in more of this, I wrote a free article. It's called Beyond Kale and Pedicures, and I can send it to you, or you can find it on our website. And what I say in there is actually, on the contrary, I believe that we have an ethical duty to take care of ourselves. Let's think about it for a second. I don't know about you, maybe you have a lot of really concrete tools that you use, but you know, I'm not a paramedic. I don't go and intubate people and do stuff and like set broken bone. Like I don't know how to do any of that. The only thing I really know how to do, other than talk clearly, and be insanely funny, no, the only thing I really know how to do is be present and assess and listen and talk people down and read a room and read a person's body language and what they're saying. And, you know, I mean, really, many of us, isn't it true that what our jobs require us to be on, like full on? Have you ever been to work when you shouldn't have been? Like maybe you'd had a very upsetting fight with your spouse or a family member. Or maybe, I'm sure you've never done this, but like hypothetically, can you imagine going to work totally hungover? Or I'm sure you've done this, gone to work with the flu, like you shouldn't be there and you're white-knuckling it through the day. And are you able to be fully present? And the truth is that when we are emotionally, physically, and psychologically compromised, we make mistakes. And I truly believe that we also have this weird macho mentality in our, you know, in our fields where we're kind of like, I'm so cool. Someone said this to me recently. She was a child abuse investigator in Florida. She said, I haven't taken a vacation in 3 years. Like she was so proud of that. And I thought to myself, I think that's unethical. Now, I'm not blaming her, but I hope you understand that there's a realization at some point that it's not okay for us to do this work totally compromised. I remember at some point watching a union group. They were renegotiating a collective agreement of our city, blue-collar workers, I think. And they were said to me, we agree, you know, they negotiate for months, and they're all outside my office smoking a dart all the time, and which always makes me laugh. And I remember at some point they said, we came to an agreement at 4 o'clock in the morning. No one left the room till we just, and I thought, is that what we want? Do we want big decisions to be made at 4 o'clock in the morning when no one has a pee and eaten for months? Like, I just think sometimes, anyways. So I do believe that self-care is important, but I don't think it's enough. And I also do think that your organization has a responsibility to offer you working conditions that are conducive to you doing your job properly. And that's what we're starting to see with some really exciting changes. As you know, probably in Ontario, the Minister of Labour has been successfully pushed for a bill that was recognizing, you know, that you could actually claim WSIB as a paramedic, for example, if you had been exposed to traumatic things. You know, there's a recognition that this is real. And I do believe that we have a shared responsibility and that organizations can't keep on, you know, using and disposing of their staff. Now, I also want to add that a lot of organizations that I interact with absolutely do not do that they care deeply about their staff. They're very concerned, but they have incredibly limited resources. And I get that question all the time. People say to me, well, I don't think you understand. You know, yesterday the judges were rolling their eyes when I said control over their schedule because they're like, are you kidding me? We can't control our schedule. And I said, I know. I know that some of you don't have control over those elements, but there's things we need to look at the whole picture and how can we improve the way this work is being done. All right. So what we've also found has been really helpful, and this was backed up by Kyle Killian's study, is having a constructive and supportive team. The problem with that is when there aren't enough resources to go around, unfortunately we turn on each other. And that's actually referred to as the poverty mentality, where people start feeling like, yeah, they just don't have enough resources, and so people turn on each other, and it leads to a very toxic work environment. And that's a whole other workshop that I talk about, you know, those issues in. There's some really interesting research that's demonstrating that regular rotation of heavy traumatic material is really important. Again, when I was in Huntsville a couple of years ago, I met someone who does polygraph tests on parents all day, and he said he'd been exposed to a tremendous amount of traumatic material, and he had done a child pornography investigation before that. And he said, I'm just going to keep working. I only have 12 years, 2 months, 1 day left in this field. Well, I don't agree. I think that lots of research is demonstrating that we need to rotate our caseload and that we can't all be, you know, It's problematic when you have an agency where one person is the expert on one particular topic, because then that's all they start seeing. And expertise is great, but as it relates to trauma exposure, it can actually be a problem. What also works, and I talk about this in my longer workshops, if you've been to one, I talk a lot about self-awareness, the importance of monitoring where you're at and how you're doing. And I used, a little modification of what folks use in the military to assess deployment readiness, and we call it the green, yellow, red. And green, you all know what that looks like. You're brand new to the field, or you've just come back from a lengthy, beautiful yoga retreat in Tahiti. You know what the green zone looks like. The yellow zone is where we start seeing warning signs of stress effects, and the red zone is when we are absolutely crispy fried, and maybe we're even on stress leave. Or maybe we're exhibiting symptoms of PTSD or secondary trauma or anxiety or depression or stuff like that. So what I always invite people to think about is, what does your yellow zone look like? How do you know you're headed for trouble? What are those warning signs? And, I always say, if you're not sure what they are, ask your loved ones. They will be delighted to tell you. Because, your dog knows when you're in the yellow zone. And I always call them the big three, and the big three are your number one physical, emotional, and behavioral symptom. So how does your body let you know that you're in trouble? Some of us get migraines, some of us grind our teeth, some of us have heartburn, some of us have irritable bowel, some of us have back pain, and it's often the same thing that comes over and over again, but many of us, what we do is we ignore, or we medicate. Meanwhile, our poor little body's doing its best to try and tell you what's going on. What are some behaviors that you engage in? And this is not a judgment, it's none of my business what you do, legal or whatever, but I think that we can see the difference between times where we do something that's just pleasurable and in moderation, and often it's also the same thing that becomes a way that we numb out. So an example of that would be, a lot of us enjoy having a glass of wine or a beer after dinner, or before dinner, or maybe at a barbecue. But if it becomes something where every single day you're thinking, it's 5 o'clock somewhere and you can't wait to get home to numb, you're numbing out. You're not using it in that adaptive way. The same is true for smoking. For eating. So some people say, oh, I don't drink, I don't do drugs, I'm so virtuous, but they eat till they fall down. And most of us, when we are stressed, we do not crave carrots or broccoli, we crave sugar, salt, and fat. I have seen, I work in hospitals a lot, I see a lot of obese nurses, which is, interesting and problematic. And a lot of them say that they're struggling with their shift work, and at 3 o'clock in the morning they don't have the energy to make healthy meals, and it's also partly their stress effect because they're living on adrenaline all the time. Some people talk about shopping like that. I mean, pick your thing, right? You know the difference between buying something because you need it and shopping to numb out. And this is not just women. In the military, a lot of soldiers purchase items that they're far too expensive for them, and big pickup truck, power tools, Sea-Doos, and it's a way of them numbing out. So I'm just inviting you to think about, what's your most frequent one, and how do you know it's a problem? Mine is definitely Netflix in terms of this. When I'm well, if I've done a workshop or I've done a lot of trauma work, I don't go home and read. My brain's not there. I need to numb out and be kind of vegging. But what I watch is a warning sign. So when I'm well, I'm going to watch something light. I might watch a couple, I don't know, the stuff that's on right now, the Mindy Kaling show, or what, Master of None, or like something funny. And when I'm not well, I might watch, all 6 seasons of Breaking Bad and become kind of obsessed with it. So for me, that's a warning sign, and I invite you to think about what yours is. And the third aspect, so there was the physical and then the behavioral aspect, and the third aspect is kind of, behavioral / emotional, and it's basically how you're feeling and how it's showing. So many of us get incredibly exhausted. Many of us become angry or irritable, and that's definitely mine. I know the difference when I'm in the yellow to close to the red zone. I have very low tolerance for things, especially with my loved ones. My loved ones might want to talk about something fun or creative, and I have basically a clipboard and a checklist and a whistle, and I'm a drill sergeant. Super fun for my loved ones when that happens. But I know now that it's happening and I can catch it early, which is kind of the goal of the big three. I'm kind of starting to wrap up now. I have a couple more things I want to talk about, and then we'll take some questions. I feel so strongly about this that I can't do it justice today. I feel like the best solution to all of this, all the kale and yoga in the world, cannot protect you if you are not properly trained to deal with the issues that you are exposed to regularly. I found this in my work. I found that I was working with a lot of folks who had very complex psychological and behavioral issues. They were often referred to as having borderline personality disorder. They would cut, they would sabotage, they were always in crisis. They were very, very draining folks. And I realized years ago that I needed to understand way more why they acted that way. Frequent flyers, you know, sometimes we refer to them in that term. The same is true, physicians talk to me about that. A lot of physicians say to me, you know, family doctors, they'll say, oh my gosh, I am so tired of seeing the same people all the time. I make recommendations, they never get better, or they don't even try what I told them. The same is true with paramedics. They tell me that the bulk of their calls are not life and death. They have those too, but that they're often, you know, complex people who have a long history of calling and they call every week and it's not for real. And so chronicity of exposure is inherently depleting. We get depleted when people don't move. Domestic violence, police officers who work in domestic violence talk about that all the time, you know, that they feel drained or frustrated when you know, women keep on returning to their abusive partners and they're like, why don't they go? Why don't they leave after the X number of time? And then they're trained and they realize that, you know, for example, in the Yukon, women return to their abusive partners on average 90 times. So if you know that they're going to return 90 times, you're not going to get mad after 30, right? Because you're going to know the context. So I find that becoming trauma-informed is exactly that. It's having a larger context for why people are behaving in the ways that seem to you frustrating or maladaptive or, quite frankly, sabotage. Now, in the interest of time, I'm just going to direct you to this fabulous TED Talk if you haven't seen it before, and that's your homework if you will. Have a listen to this, and Dr. Burke-Harris explains very clearly what the Adverse Childhood Experiences study was, how it started in the late 90s, how it informed all of the work that we do now. And, you know, put very briefly, we know that having 4 or more experiences, ACEs stand for Adverse Childhood Experiences, having 4 or more crappy things happen to you before the age of 18 leads to a dramatic increase in maladaptive, unhealthy behaviors and physical and mental health. We know that. We also know, I don't have the data right in front of me here, but we know that people who have 4 or more adverse childhood experiences are many, many times more likely to develop cancer, are many, many times more likely to commit suicide, are often less responsive to certain medications, are often overdiagnosed with ADHD, what have you, are often labeled as difficult or non-compliant. And the original study actually came out of an obesity study. Actually, if you're interested in this, there's a really good book that talks about it. It's called Childhood Disrupted. And she explains the whole history. It's really, really good read. She's a scientific journalist. And she talks about all of those issues as well. Okay, to conclude, I'm very interested in resiliency. I think that we need to find ways to protect ourselves so that we can be present and able to handle whatever gets thrown our way in terms of dealing with children with difficult stories. And, you know, in this case, we refer to resiliency as being able to bounce back from difficulties, but also strengthening ourselves for when the going gets tough. There's tons of data now that indicates that all of these modalities help in becoming more resilient. Mindfulness helps. If you're interested in this, I highly recommend the book by Bessel van der Kolk called The Body Keeps the Score. It's one of the best books I've ever read. I just went to his training. It was mind-blowing. The Body Keeps the Score. And in it, he talks about exactly that. Why is it that these different modalities, such as, you know, relaxation training and EMDR and EFT, why do they work? Well, we think they work, and this is Pat Ogden's work, we think they work because what they're doing is they're widening what we call your window of tolerance. Very, very quickly, this is how to understand, we love the acronym because it's WTF. This is how to understand WTF. Have you ever had a situation where you spilt milk all inside your fridge? And you probably know if you spill milk inside your fridge, you got to clean it because it's going to smell. It's awful, right? Have you ever had that happen and some days you're like, oh, well, that sucks. Off we go. I'm going to clean my fridge. Or maybe you're even like, oh, well, I had to clean my fridge anyway. And other instances where you're like, it's the end of the world and you end up, having a huge screaming tantrum on the floor because you're so frustrated. Well, that's got to do with your window of tolerance. And for a variety of reasons, your window of tolerance was not very big on the second instance. Well, the truth is that people with 4 or more adverse childhood experiences or people with post-traumatic stress disorder related to other things have often a very small tolerance capacity, and they bump out to high arousal, so freaking out, or depression extremely quickly. And so what has been discovered is these modalities, such as mindfulness, neurofeedback, and others, are extremely helpful because what they do over time is to help you widen your ability to tolerate things as they come your way. Now, a lot of people say to me, mindfulness doesn't work. I don't like it. It works, but you need to do it like 8 to 12 weeks every single day for 10 minutes. And as John Kabat-Zinn said, who is the founding father of mindfulness in our field, he says, you don't have to like it, you just got to do it, which I really like. Okay, I want to wrap up by offering you one more piece, and this is something I'm going to talk more about at our annual conference, which is next week in Toronto, by the way. It's kind of a reflection about what do you need to have in place in order to do this challenging job. Now, I'm going to show you, I filled this out, I call it the balance map. It might not look like that for you at all, but this is my version. So this is yours. What would you put in there? What do you need in order to be optimally able to do this work? I populated it this way. As I said, it might not be yours. So, for me, getting enough sleep is crucial. Eating healthy 90% of the time and exercising 6 days a week is crucial for me, for my mental health and my well-being. Might not matter to you. My husband does not actually need a lot of sleep. He wouldn't put that up top there, but he needs to exercise. Simplifying, I'm not suggesting that your house needs to be real estate ready, but it sure is nice to find stuff when it's, when it's income tax time. It sure is nice not to have to destroy your house to find your statement of whatever it's called. When it's the first snow of the year, it sure is nice to be able to find the snow pants. Oh no, they don't fit the kids anymore. What are we, like living in chaos every day, without necessarily being completely OCD. Living in chaos every day leads to, you start out stressed, your car's almost out of gas, you get to your appointments half an hour too late. That means you're living on adrenaline all the time, to quote Cheryl Richardson. So, sometimes when I have more time, I go through all of these. They can look like something else for you, but I know for me, I need to understand how I react to change. So when there's change and uncertainty, what is my coping mechanism and how do I react to that? And there's a lot of change, right, at work. I need social and emotional support. I like to have engaging hobbies. I also like to have an interesting job. I don't like being bored, so I've had some career changes for that reason. Trauma stewardship refers to Laura Van Den Lipsky's book, How Do I Manage Regular Exposure? How do I deal with occupational stress and resentment? That's the piece about moral distress. And how do I give back? Now, I'm not suggesting that on top of the job you do, you have to go out there and volunteer at night in a women's shelter. What I'm suggesting is I sometimes feel like some things frustrate me so much that I need to put my money where my mouth is. For example, instead of saying, oh, it's terrible that they're going to build this thing down the road. Well, did I go to the meeting? Did I go to the city hall? Did I protest? Like, did I actually do anything? So getting engaged in our community in those various ways, I find, fills my boots. All right, just to conclude, I want to invite you to think about, who's on your side here? Who's on your team? And we need accountability partners. We need people to lovingly but firmly also say, hey, did you do that thing? Let's go out tonight. Let's go for a walk, and people can't read your mind, so maybe we need to tell them what we need as well. This comes from Stephen Covey. It's called The Circles of Influence. Maybe you've seen it in 7 Habits. He basically says, sometimes we have absolutely no control or influence with the bigger picture, which is often the case for us. So what do you focus on? Well, you focus on things that are within your control. I can control, maybe I can't control my hours of work, but I can sure as heck control who I talk to at work. And maybe I'm not going to talk to the biggest gossip every day. Or maybe I'm not going to have a bitch fest about work. Or maybe I'm going to read a book or go to a website or what have you, and that kind of stuff. I also really invite people to make tiny micro movements, like really small changes, as opposed to major, huge New Year's resolutions that we never do. And I'm going to invite you to think about today, if this was useful to you, what's one small change that you could make, or a resource, or one of the things that I mentioned, one of the webinars or TED Talk. Is there something you could consult or someone that you could speak to? So in a nutshell, what we talked about today was basically this. I invite you to get more training in trauma-informed care. I think it's essential in our field. Continue to enhance your social support. Identify your big 3 warning signs. Look at developing a wellness practice and some grounding skills. Continue to advocate for change, but also decide what you can control. If you're interested in more of this, I wrote a free article on this topic. It's on the website. You can take a look at it. And it's called Beyond Kale and Pedicures, as I mentioned. There's also a free 20-minute video on our YouTube channel that was recorded for the Ottawa paramedics. This is all free stuff, believe me. I'm not trying to sell you anything. It's all free resources. This is our annual conference, which happens every year. We're also going to be, as I mentioned, in Edmonton in October with the Zebra Center. And as we take questions, I'm going to share with you my assistant's email address. If you want any resources or you have additional questions, please don't hesitate to drop us a line. We'll be very happy to talk to you. Signe, I'm more than happy to turn it over to you now and find out if there were any questions.
I'm just going to give it a minute for people to ask their questions, and I'll read them out to you as they come in.
Perfect. Is there anything coming in, Signe?
Not yet, but I'll give it another minute.
Sure.
Sorry, where do we send the questions in the chat?
Yes. So we have one question asking when you're coming to Edmonton.
Oh, I believe it is the week of October 10th. I'm just going to check my calendar right now. So the Zebra Center, there are 3 things going on that week, and we're kind of piggybacking on a grant that they have. Yes, I believe it's the week of October 10th. One day will be the Care for You conference. We're going to have a one-day symposium, and we're also going to have a one-day pre-conference event with a variety of presentations on all the different things I talked about today, but in more depth with our entire team. So if you're interested to know more about that, join our mailing list either by going to our website or emailing us, and as soon as the Zebra stuff is out, we will be sending it to everyone.
Any resource recommended on trauma-informed care?
Yes, I would recommend that you go to the traumainformedcareproject.org. That's all one word, traumainformedcareproject.org. I believe that watching Nadine Burke-Harris's TED Talk is essential. It kind of gives you the whole context. And I believe that reading the book Childhood Disrupted also gives you really good background. But if you go to the traumainformedcareproject.org, they have a wonderful website with tons and tons of free resources.
All right, I think that's it for questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, all of you, and I hope this was useful. As you probably know, it will be recorded, so if you want to share it with other folks, Signe, that's pretty easy to do, right?
Yes, I actually just got one question now.
Oh, great.
I work with the government in policy and program work. We support multiple frontline workers in different agencies. Lately, many of these workers have been coming to us with issues in the workplace, burnout. What recommendations can we give them without getting too involved with the policies at the agency, or politics at the agency, sorry?
That's a really big question. It's a big question. I don't know if I can answer that this briefly. Here's the issue. I think that one of the things that became like almost like a reflex by, HR or managers is to say to staff, have you called EAP? Have you gone to your employee assistance program? And that sometimes is a really good idea, and sometimes, unfortunately, it's not worked out that well. And the reason for that is some of the EAPs are good, and some of them are, quite frankly, terrible. I'm being very candid here. There's a whole mixture out there. And I also think that the problem sometimes is that the employee assistance counselor, if it's even available, are not trauma-informed, and they're not actually secondary trauma-informed. And so they may not even think of asking the client whether they work in a high trauma exposed field. So part of the challenge here is we need to kind of take an analysis of like, what is the issue at hand? Is it volume of work? Is it exposure? Is it management? Is it relationships with peers? And it's often a combination of all of those things. And so I think it's okay to recommend that people get support, but it's got to be the right kind of support, if you know what I mean. So if you're interested in those types of resources, Dr. Fisher on our, and again, I feel weird recommending something from my website, but I make no money off this book, so I'm not trying to sell anything. Dr. Fisher on our website has written 2 excellent books on this topic. One of them is called Building Resilient Teams, and it gets supervisors and people in leadership to kind of do a whole assessment of all the different stress effects that are going on and kind of identify where to start, what's the entry point. And the other book she's written is called Resilience, Balance, and Meaning. And her book gets, again, people to do an inventory of see where they're at. So you're right, we don't want to get into, you know, embroiled in someone's issues and their complaints about their workplace situation, but where do we start? So I would recommend these resources. I would also recommend that, you know, someone needs to do a bit of an audit of, you know, workload and exposure and all of those elements, not just tell people to go to EAP.
The last question is, are you going out to British Columbia at all?
Like ever in life? Sure. In fact, Pat Fisher is based in Victoria, BC. So she's there all the time. So she does training there. And I am going to the Yukon in July. And I can't remember that I have a current speaking engagement in BC in the coming year. But that could change. But Dr. Fisher is out in Victoria.
And you are?
Yes, I am. That's us.
All right, I think that's it for questions.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I wish you all the best, and I hope this was helpful to all of you.